2 days after this man died, a strange guest paid a visit to his family in what would be one of the most unusual and mysterious occurrences. Was this witchcraft, or was it a coincidence? Or was this just a friend coming to pay his last respect?
Shangaa sana na tukio kama hilo. Kwa sababu boma hii walikuwa na survive hata kitaaluma yao ya kikazi kama huyu Dr. William.
Dr. Williams Ewo was a snake charmer, a renowned snake handler in Kenya, with a rather long history of dealing with reptiles, snakes of every kind, and pythons in particular. He captured them for tourism, keeping them safe and extracting venoms, which he sold to pharmaceuticals in the creation of anti-venoms. After many years of working with a white man named Jonathan Leakey in catching snakes and extracting venoms from them in Kisumu, Kenya, Ewa would return back home in Baringo, where he would begin his own personal reptile collection. With all the training and experience he got from working with Jonathan Leakey, Williams Ewa was completely equipped with the knowledge of how to go about finding snakes, dealing with them, making them trust him, and keeping them in cages. Over time, when he was back in Baringo, he was able to capture a good amount of snakes, in which he created a reptile park from it in Baringo. This reptile park became very popular amongst tourists. In fact, people from far and wide would come to Kenya, to Baringo, to the reptile park that this man had created just to watch him handle the snakes. Some would take pictures with the snakes under his guidance, and some would pay to even watch him put the snakes in his mouth. He was good with the snakes. He was calm with them. He never harmed or hurt any of these reptiles. As a man who did not go to school or did not have any educational background, this became his thing. This became his source of livelihood and his passion. However, towards the early 2000s, things started going bad for him, especially when his reptile zoo was confiscated by the police, citing the fact that he wasn't licensed to operate a zoo with these dangerous animals. He was fined, arrested, and the snakes were taken away from him. And by this time, he was already old, thereabout in his 70s. After being arrested, he was made to serve prison terms for about 6 months, which he did. By the time Dr. Williams Ewa was done serving his jail term, he came out into the society with nothing to do. His snakes had been taken away from him. His source of livelihood has also been taken away from him. He would return back to his village to continue living the rest of his life. But at this time, he was already getting old. He was already approaching 80. Age was no longer on his side, youth was no longer on his side, and neither was his health by his side. However, that was the only thing he knew how to do. And while he was in his hometown, in his village, it was said he continued his passion for finding reptiles. Most times, whenever villagers around would see a snake around their vicinity, they would call on him to get this snake and capture them. Away from his home, it was said he started another smaller reptile zoo where he started keeping some of these snakes he would catch in cages in the hopes of, rebranding or remaking another zoo for the reptiles that may attract tourists. Even though he wasn't licensed, although despite not being licensed, he was recognized by an organization citing his experience with these animals. But that might have not been enough. It's not clear how his later years in his hometown, in his village, was for him ever since he came out of prison. But sources had it that he most likely struggled to regain back his relevance after the whole prison gate. But his dealings with these reptiles did not exactly stop. It was said he would pay villagers to help find snakes for him, and the little ones he paid little amount of money for, the bigger ones he paid more amount of money for, and somewhere in town or somewhere around his community, in the major parts, he also started a low-key reptile zoo where people would come, take pictures with the snakes, and, pay money for it. It was pretty much the only thing he knew how to do. So even though he wasn't licensed, I guess for some weird reason, that was kind of like what he can only do to make a living for himself and for his family. Unfortunately, on the 30th of June 2021, Dr. Williams Ewa lost his life after a brief illness, and by this time he was already in his 80s. On the 1st of July, he was buried in his compound in his village near his hut where he grew up and lived. It was the end part of his life. And after his burial on the 2nd, in the middle of the night, when his family were sleeping in their home, they were visited by a very long python that came slithering through, first around his gravesite before the snake was spotted going into the home of Dr. Williams Ewa. It was said in the middle of the night, which wasn't captured on tape. The family observed that the snake was first seen on Dr. Ewa's grave, and then they saw it moving into the hut, and it climbed on the dead man's bed, where it stayed all night till the next morning. And by the morning time, the family had called other members of the community, even including the press, because the snake was still around. And it was captured on tape, literally doing it all over again, paying a visit around the gravesite of the late man and going all the way back into the house where he climbed around, slithering around the home. And this was observed by a lot of the villagers who were confused. And many people, according to the family, even especially the family, believed that they weren't worried, they weren't afraid. To them, they believed the snake had come to pay homage or pay last respect to a friend. They don't know how the snake might have known it that Dr. Ewa was dead, but they believe due to his relationship with these reptiles, somehow, some way, this particular snake, who wasn't part of his collection, just to be clear, this snake was just a new snake that they were seeing for the first time. It was not part of his collection. There's a possibility, or there's also an assumption that the snake had traveled miles away after he died and had gotten the signal after Dr. Williams had died, and it was already on its way to visit. And probably it took him the entire time, 2 days, before he could get to the compound. So a lot of people presume that the snake got the information and traveled miles from the thick forest in the village down to the burial site of this man who was very good with the reptiles. Eventually, the snake was taken and probably kept along with part of his collection by his son or one of his children, who I believe also got to learn the art of catching and dealing with the snakes. Hopefully, Dr. Williams' kids or children would continue the tradition, because it seems like a good tourist idea and a good source of living. Hopefully they get a license to make it a lot more legal. Dr. Williams' story is actually more elaborate than this, so you can Google and search. From what I could get, or the part of his story to me that actually I think got to me, was when he was working with Jonathan Leakey, who Jonathan, by the way, was said to be one of the children of a group of archaeologists, a family of archaeologists. But Jonathan decided to dive into looking for snakes. And in the process of looking for snakes, he hired Williams Ewoy to assist him. So Williams was one of the people, because Williams had a background in farm animals. He was a farmer. He did farming. Growing up, it wasn't very easy for him. He did bricklaying. He did hard labors. It was later on when Jonathan Leakey hired him to attract the snakes, and Jonathan and his team would catch the snakes. It was while working for Jonathan that he started learning so much more about these reptiles. However, when he left Jonathan to start his own reptile zoo, it was said it was due to the fact that Jonathan was not paying him very well. And I think that is very sad, because this man pretty much died a poor man for what it's looking, given to where he's living and given to his kind of job, because I felt like collecting venoms from snake at the time must have been a big deal, because the Jonathan Leakey and his team were making millions from it. They were selling these venoms, but for some reason, Williams wasn't being paid enough. He didn't feel like he was even treated well enough, according to some articles. Some articles claim that Williams did not feel like his time with Jonathan was appreciated. And so he pretty much left to start his own practice of collecting these reptiles and forming his own local reptile zoo, which a lot of people found entertaining, by the way. This Jonathan story kind of reminds me of that National Geographic Channel video that was going viral at the time, when a group of white animal scientists, or whites, I don't know who they are, used an African boy with a poison around his leg and make him put his leg inside a hole that got the attraction of a very big python. And a mind that kept thinking, oh, wow, they had to use this black boy to get that snake. So when I heard that Dr. Williams' time wasn't appreciated while working with Jonathan, I just assumed it could have been one of those things where he was just used for the most part. But the good thing is that he learned so much from his time with the Jonathan and his team, and that, I think, kind of helped him later on in creating his own and probably teaching his children or whoever was his protege about the practice of dealing with snake. A lot of people believe, though, that the snake must have been a coincidence. Some people who are not Kenyans called it witchcraft in the initial videos, but personally, I think it's most likely the snake coming to pay his last respects. For the snake to come directly to his house, go to his graveside and go to his house, go to his bed to spend the night and still stay till the next morning. I don't doubt that this snake had come to pay homage or pay his last respects, because this man lived his life handling snakes and snakes trust him. So I'm sure they picked it up somewhere. I'm sure it felt the man's absence somehow, somewhere. You know, a lot of these animals, they are kind of sacred for a reason. Snakes are sacred animals, especially these kinds of pythons. In a lot of communities in Africa, they don't kill the snakes. They adore the snakes and there's some worship the snake. The snake is a big symbol in the land, and that is because of how sacred some of these animals are. And I think anyone who spends the rest of their life or their entire time dealing with a certain group of animals, over time there would be a connection that would be made. Over time they would be able to connect to these animals, and in rare occasions something like this would happen, where if he dies, one or two of them would come around to pay their last respects. But you guys let me know your thoughts. Do you think this snake was actually paying its last respect, or do you think the snake was actually just a coincidence? Let me know your thoughts.